Picture this. It's June 18th, 1815, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered most of Europe, who defeated armies 10 times larger than his own, who rewrote the rules of warfare, is watching his empire collapse at Waterloo. But here's what most history books don't tell you. Napoleon didn't lose at Waterloo because of military mistakes. He lost because he was broke. By 1814, France's government debt had soared to nearly 1.7 billion francs. The 1814 budget showed a deficit of 579 million francs, more than half the entire budget. Even at the start of his final 100 days, the War Ministry alone owed 247 million francs in unpaid bills. Meanwhile, his enemy, Britain, had access to virtually unlimited credit thanks to a banking system so sophisticated that one family, the Rothschilds, could almost single-handedly finance the entire British war effort. Napoleon conquered kingdoms, but he couldn't conquer the one thing that mattered most: the world of finance. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. The story of Napoleon's financial collapse begins with what seemed like a brilliant strategy. If you can't defeat Britain militarily, destroy them economically. On November 21st, 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree forbidding all his allies and conquered territories from trading with Britain. He called it the Continental System. The logic seemed sound. Britain was a trading nation. Cut off their trade, and their economy would collapse. Force them to sue for peace. It was economic warfare on a scale never attempted before, and it backfired spectacularly. Within months of the decree, 1,475 ships arrived in Hamburg carrying British goods estimated at 590,000 tons, without any impediment whatsoever. Illicit trade between Britain and Holland alone was worth more than £4.5 million from 1807 to 1809. The Continental System became a joke. Everyone knew it, and everyone ignored it. But here's the real problem. While British exports to continental Europe fell by 25% to 55%, they simply redirected their trade to the rest of the world. British trade with Asia, Africa, and the Americas surged, covering much of the losses. Meanwhile, the Continental System was destroying the French economy. The great Atlantic ports of Nantes, Bordeaux, and Amsterdam never recovered. Shipbuilding collapsed. Sugar refining collapsed. The axis of European trade shifted decisively inland, away from French-controlled ports. By 1811, Napoleon himself was forced to admit failure. He issued the St. Cloud Decree, opening the southwest of France and the Spanish frontier to British trade. A tacit admission that the blockade hurt France more than Britain. Italy's silk manufacturing sector was nearly completely decimated because all silk had to be produced in France. The Italian economy was severely damaged, creating massive civil discontent in one of Napoleon's most important territories. Napoleon had tried to wage economic warfare against Britain and ended up crippling his own economy instead. But destroying your own economy wouldn't have been fatal if Napoleon had found another way to pay for his wars. He thought he had plunder. Napoleon believed his wars should be self-financing. After each victory, he insisted on knowing the financial gains. "I did not make as much from this campaign as I did from the last," he wrote after the Battle of Wagram. The theory was beautiful in its simplicity. Conquer territories, extract extraordinary contributions from them, use that money to fund the next campaign. War feeds war. And for a while, it worked. After defeating Prussia in 1807, Napoleon extracted 154.5 million francs, 97 million in extraordinary contributions, and 57.5 million in ordinary contributions. Prussia alone paid massive sums. Austrian taxation rose from 75 million francs in 1805 to 164 million in 1809. Prussia contributed between 470 and 514 million francs from 1806 to 1812. All told, Europe paid about 414 million francs in extraordinary contributions between 1805 and 1813, though only 276 million actually made it into French coffers. Napoleon's armies lived off the land, requisitioning food, supplies, and valuables from conquered territories. In Poland, occupied since 1806, peasants hid food in the woods, at the tops of trees, or in pits covered with soil and branches. When our soldiers suspected a hiding spot, they would skillfully probe the ground with their rifle rods. This system of plunder and tribute funded about 42% of Napoleon's war costs. Not bad, except war costs were exploding. In 1811, the army budget was 460 million francs, eventually rising to 506 million. Army and Navy expenditures absorbed 60% of the entire state budget of 954 million francs. This was the year budget deficits began appearing. By 1812, military expenditure hit 710 million francs. In 1813, it reached 817 million. The costs were spiraling out of control faster than Napoleon could extract tribute. And he couldn't just borrow money to cover the difference. France's credit was destroyed. They had squandered their financial reputation during the chaos of the ancient regime and the revolution. The assignat hyperinflation had made French paper money worthless. The value had plunged from 31% of silver currency in July 1794 to just 8% in March 1795. Some 45 billion livres worth of paper had been printed by 1797, collectively worth less than 1/7 that amount. The recent memory of this hyperinflation meant nobody trusted French government promises anymore. Borrowing would have been exceedingly costly, and the public was very skeptical of the empire's ability to repay. Napoleon was forced to rely almost entirely on taxation and plunder because credit markets were closed to him. Meanwhile, Britain had the opposite problem. Thanks to its long history of fiscal responsibility and parliamentary control of budgets, Britain could borrow at relatively low interest rates. British tax rates remained stable throughout the 18th century, and peacetime surpluses offset wartime deficits, ensuring accumulated debts would be repaid. But Britain's real financial weapon was a family you might have heard of, the Rothschilds. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, operating from London between 1813 and 1815, almost single-handedly financed the British war effort. He organized the shipment of bullion to the Duke of Wellington's armies across Europe and arranged payment of British subsidies to continental allies. In 1815 alone, the Rothschilds provided £9.8 million, equivalent to about £850 million in today's money, in subsidy loans to Britain's continental allies. The Rothschild family had developed a network of agents, shippers, and couriers to transport gold across war-torn Europe. Their network gave them political and financial information ahead of everyone else, providing advantages in financial markets that Napoleon couldn't match. Britain could finance coalition after coalition against France. Every time Napoleon defeated one alliance, British gold funded the next one. It was a war of financial attrition, and France was losing. Then came 1812, and Napoleon made the decision that would bankrupt his empire. The Russian campaign alone cost 700 million francs, more than the entire French military budget just 2 years earlier. It was a financial catastrophe before it became a military one. Napoleon's initial force entering Russia exceeded 450,000 men. The surviving count dwindled to a mere 120,000, approximately 380,000 lives lost throughout the campaign. Of the 615,000 French and Allied troops who crossed the Niemen in June 1812, fewer than 100,000 staggered back 6 months later. Between invasion and retreat, the French suffered 500,000 casualties, 300,000 killed, with the overwhelming majority dying from disease or weather rather than combat. But the strategic failure was even worse than the military disaster. The Russian army refused to engage in the one big battle Napoleon always sought. They retreated, burned their own cities, and waited for winter. When the Russian winter began and the Tsar refused to negotiate peace, Napoleon was forced to retreat from Moscow. The catastrophic defeat shattered his reputation of invincibility and demonstrated that his entire financial model, war funding war through plunder, could collapse when a campaign failed. You can't extract tribute from territory you don't hold. You can't requisition supplies from burned cities. The Russian campaign proved that Napoleon's financial system only worked when he won quickly and decisively, and the costs kept mounting. At the same time as the Russian disaster, Napoleon was hemorrhaging money in Spain. By 1810, almost 300,000 imperial troops were bogged down in Iberia, fighting Spanish resistance and British forces. Napoleon later wrote, "That unfortunate war destroyed me. All the circumstances of my disasters are bound up in that fatal knot." The Peninsular campaigns witnessed 60 major battles and 30 major sieges, more than any other Napoleonic conflict, and lasted over 6 years. France lost at least 91,000 killed in action and 237,000 wounded. This was a second front that Napoleon couldn't afford, draining resources while producing no plunder to offset the costs. Spain became an open wound that bled French finances dry. By 1813, the financial situation was desperate. The deficit had grown from a modest 6.5 million francs in 1811 to 149 million francs in 1813. But the real situation was worse because these figures didn't include the War Ministry's mounting unpaid bills. Measured against the additional expenditure incurred by imperial finances, over 3 billion francs needed between 1805 and 1815, Napoleon's self-financing war supplied just over 600 million. To fill the deficit, France resorted to new taxes, property sales, and forced deposits by state officers. Tax receipts as a percentage of economic output rose from around 5% in the 1790s to between 14% and 20% from 1806 to 1814. Napoleon was squeezing his own population harder and harder, but it still wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Britain's financial advantage kept growing. While Napoleon was forced to conscript soldiers at low wages because he couldn't afford professional armies, Britain used its superior credit to hire and equip well-supplied troops. While Napoleon's supply lines collapsed in Russia, British gold ensured Wellington's army in Spain remained well-fed and equipped. While Napoleon struggled to replace lost artillery after each campaign, British factories produced weapons faster than Wellington could use them. The Battle of Waterloo in June 1815 was the final proof that financial power trumps military genius. Napoleon had returned from exile on Elba and raised a new army in just 100 days. His military brilliance was undimmed, but his treasury was empty. The War Ministry still owed 247 million francs in unpaid bills from previous campaigns. Napoleon couldn't afford proper supplies, couldn't afford enough ammunition, couldn't afford the reinforcements that might have changed the battle's outcome. Meanwhile, Wellington's army was backed by unlimited British credit and Rothschild gold. Every soldier was fed, every gun had ammunition, every position was reinforced. When the Prussians arrived to reinforce Wellington, because Britain had paid them to come, Napoleon's fate was sealed. Not by military strategy, but by the simple fact that Britain could afford allies, and Napoleon couldn't. After Waterloo, the Allies demanded reparations totaling 1.4 billion francs from France. Combined with existing debts, the sums exacted from France effectively canceled out the nearly 1.8 billion francs Napoleon had obtained through plunder during all his campaigns. In other words, the self-financing war turned out to be an advance that had to be repaid by future generations. Napoleon's entire financial model was a lie that only worked as long as he kept winning. The moment he stopped winning, the bills came due, and France couldn't pay them. Here's what this teaches us about financial power versus military power. Napoleon was arguably the greatest military commander in history. He revolutionized warfare, defeated coalitions of enemies, conquered most of Europe, and commanded armies with genius that still amazes military historians today, but he lost to Britain. Not because British generals were better, but because British bankers were better. The Rothschilds could move gold across war-torn Europe when Napoleon's supply lines collapsed. Britain could borrow at low rates when France couldn't borrow at all. British credit financed coalition after coalition when Napoleon could barely pay his own troops. The continental system that was supposed to destroy British trade ended up destroying French ports instead. The plunder that was supposed to finance French wars only worked until a campaign failed. The self-financing war model collapsed the moment Napoleon couldn't keep conquering new territory fast enough. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore. Like Napoleon's continental system, Modern sanctions attempt to economically isolate adversaries, but often backfire. Like Britain's pound sterling, the dollar's reserve status allows America to finance deficits others cannot. Like Britain funding European allies against Napoleon, America finances allied military efforts globally. Napoleon's France saw war costs spiral from 460 million francs in 1811 to 817 million in 1813. The Russian campaign alone cost 700 million francs. Final debt reached 1.7 billion francs by 1814. Collapse came when France could no longer sustain its armies. The lesson is eternal. No amount of military genius can overcome financial exhaustion. Britain won not through superior generalship, but through superior credit, banking, and the ability to sustain long wars through financial resilience that Napoleon could never match. Thank you for watching my Money Mint.